My department head didn't know I'd just won a prestigious international research grant when he said, "Let's be honest, your work is forgettable. No serious institution would ever fund you." The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and ego. 14 faculty members sat around the long mahogany table on the 6th floor of Whitfield Hall, and every single one of them was staring at me. Not with curiosity or respect, but with that particular brand of academic pity reserved for someone being publicly dismantled by a man who signs off on their tenure file. Professor Graham Ashworth stood at the head of the table, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the fluorescent light, his tweed jacket buttoned like armor. He had just finished a 12-minute assessment of my research output that could be summarized in one sentence. I was a waste of departmental resources. My phone was in my jacket pocket, still warm from the email I had read 19 minutes earlier in the hallway bathroom, sitting on the lid of a toilet because my legs had gone weak. The subject line had read, "Official notification, Kessler International Research Award, full funding confirmed. The Kessler Award, $230,000 over 3 years. Fewer than 40 researchers worldwide received it annually. The selection committee included Nobel laureates." And I had won it. I sat in that leather chair with my hands folded calmly on the table while Graham Ashworth told me I was forgettable, and I felt something I had never felt in 8 years at Langford University. I felt free. I need to go back to explain how I ended up in that chair, in that room, listening to a man with a receding hairline and an inflated publication record try to bury my career in front of my colleagues. My name is Nolan Carrick. I am a molecular biologist specializing in epigenetic mechanisms of neurodegenerative disease, which is a complicated way of saying I study why certain brains start destroying themselves and whether we can stop the process before it begins. I joined Langford University in the fall of 2016 as an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences. Langford is a mid-tier research university in western Pennsylvania, not Ivy League, but respectable, the kind of place that produces solid science without the spotlight. When I was hired, the department chair was a woman named Dr. Constance Fairley, a plant geneticist in her early 60s who ran the department with quiet competence. Constance had recruited me personally after reading my postdoctoral research on histone modification patterns in early-onset Alzheimer's models. She believed my work had the potential to open entirely new therapeutic avenues, and she told me so directly during my campus visit. "Nolan, this is the kind of research that changes textbooks," she had said over lunch at the faculty club. "I want to build a department where this kind of work can thrive. You'll have startup funds, lab space, and my full support." Those words had sealed my decision. I had turned down a position at a larger university in California because Constance made me feel like my research mattered, like I was not just filling a line on a budget spreadsheet, but joining a community that valued discovery. For 3 years, that promise held. Constance protected junior faculty from political nonsense, fought for our funding allocations, and created an environment where we could focus on the work. My lab grew from 2 graduate students to 6. I published 11 papers, 3 of them in high-impact journals. I secured a $180,000 grant from the National Institutes of Health and a smaller foundation grant for pilot studies on a novel epigenetic editing technique I had been developing. The technique, which I called targeted chromatin remodeling, or TCR, used a modified CRISPR delivery system to alter epigenetic markers associated with neurodegeneration without changing the underlying DNA sequence. It was risky, unconventional, and potentially revolutionary. Constance understood that. She gave me room to fail, which meant I had room to succeed. Then in the spring of 2019, Constance announced her retirement. She was 63, her husband had been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and she wanted to spend time with him while they could still travel. I understood completely, even though the news filled me with dread. Her replacement was announced that September after a search process I was not involved in despite being on the faculty committee that was supposed to participate. The dean of the College of Sciences, Dr. Warren Pritchard, had handpicked Graham Ashworth from a short list of 3 candidates and pushed his appointment through before most of us had even reviewed the finalists' materials. Graham Ashworth arrived at Langford with a reputation that preceded him like an expensive cologne, noticeable, carefully curated, and slightly irritating. He was 54, had spent 18 years at a prestigious East Coast university, and had published extensively on structural biology and protein folding. His citation count was impressive, his grant record was solid, and his LinkedIn profile read like a monument to himself. But the thing about Graham that I did not learn until much later was why he had left his previous institution. At the time, he framed it as seeking new leadership challenges and wanting to build a department in his own image. The truth was considerably less flattering. Graham's first act as department head was to restructure the research priority areas. He called it strategic alignment, which sounded reasonable until you looked at what he was actually doing. He created 3 tiers of research classification within the department. Tier 1 received the most resources, lab space, graduate student allocations, travel funding, and priority scheduling for shared equipment. Tier 2 received standard support. Tier 3 was essentially academic purgatory, minimal resources, no new hires, and subtle but persistent pressure to redirect your work toward one of the Tier 1 areas. Structural biology and protein engineering were Tier 1. Genomics and computational biology were Tier 2. Epigenetics, my field, was Tier 3. I had raised concerns about this classification in my first meeting with Graham, 2 weeks after he took over. I had prepared a brief overview of my research program, including the TCR technique and the NIH grant, and presented it to him in his new corner office that still smelled like fresh paint and self-importance. He listened politely, nodding at appropriate intervals, then leaned back in his chair and said something I would never forget. "Nolan, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but let me be candid with you. Epigenetics is a crowded field with diminishing returns. The big discoveries have been made. What you are doing, this chromatin remodeling work, it is incremental at best. If you want to thrive in this department, I would strongly encourage you to pivot toward structural approaches. That is where the funding agencies are heading, and frankly, that is where I need people." I had been so stunned that I sat there for a full 10 seconds without speaking. My research, which Constance had called textbook changing, was being dismissed as incremental by a man who had been in the building for 14 days. I had tried to push back diplomatically. "Graham, the NIH specifically funded the TCR work because the review panel considered it innovative and high impact. The field is not saturated. We are just beginning to understand how epigenetic editing can be applied therapeutically. If anything, this is an emerging frontier, not a declining one." He had smiled the way you smile at a child who insists the moon is made of cheese. "I have been in this business for 30 years, Nolan. I think I have a slightly better perspective on where the field is going than a junior researcher who has been faculty for 3 years. But I am not going to force you to change direction. I am simply telling you what I would do if I were in your position." That was the first red flag, the polite dismissal wrapped in fake concern. I had told myself he was just establishing authority, getting settled, figuring out the landscape. I rationalized his condescension as insecurity in a new role. I was wrong. Over the following year, Graham systematically dismantled my support structure with the precision of a man who had done this before. He started with space. In February 2020, he informed me that the department needed to reallocate lab space to accommodate a new structural biology hire. The lab being reallocated was mine. Not all of it, just the wet lab annex where my graduate students ran their chromatin immunoprecipitation assays, roughly a third of my total research footprint. He presented it as a temporary measure. "We will find you equivalent space once the renovation of the East Wing is complete," he had promised. The East Wing renovation was not scheduled to begin for 18 months, and when it eventually did start, there was no mention of restoring my lab space. I lost that annex permanently. My students had to schedule time in shared facilities, competing with 12 other research groups for equipment access. Experiments that used to take a day now took 3 because of scheduling bottlenecks. Then, he targeted funding. In May 2020, the department distributed its annual internal research grants, small allocations of $10,000 to $20,000 that supplemented external funding. I applied for $15,000 to purchase reagents for a new phase of the TCR project. Graham denied the application, citing budget constraints and the need to prioritize Tier 1 research areas. Meanwhile, 2 structural biology labs received $18,000 and $22,000 respectively for projects that were, by any objective measure, less innovative than mine. I had gone to Graham's office to ask about the denial. He had barely looked up from his computer. "The allocation committee made its recommendations based on departmental priorities, Nolan. Your work simply was not competitive this cycle. I would suggest you strengthen your next application." The allocation committee was 3 people. Graham chaired it and had appointed the other 2 members, both structural biologists who reported directly to him. It was not a review process. It was theater. Then came the graduate students. In academic research, graduate students are the lifeblood of a lab. They run experiments, analyze data, co-author papers, and carry projects forward. A healthy lab needs a steady pipeline of new students to replace those who graduate. In 2020, 3 prospective PhD students had listed my lab as their top choice during the admissions process. All 3 were strong candidates with relevant backgrounds in molecular biology and genetics. 2 had specifically mentioned my TCR research in their applications. Graham intervened in the admissions decisions, something department heads rarely did directly. He steered all 3 students toward other labs, telling them during recruitment weekend that my research area had limited funding prospects and that they would be better served working in structural biology or computational genomics. One of those students, a young woman named Priya Anand, who had emailed me months before applying to discuss my papers, had come to me confused after her recruitment weekend meeting with Graham. "Dr. Carrick, Professor Ashworth told me that your lab might not have funding beyond next year and that I should consider other options. Is that true?" I had felt my jaw tighten. "That is not true, Priya. My NIH grant runs through 2022, and I am applying for additional funding. Professor Ashworth does not control my external grants." But the damage was done. Priya chose another lab. The other 2 students did the same. My lab went from 6 graduate students to 4 as 2 finished their degrees that spring, and I had no incoming replacements. I raised this with Graham directly, keeping my tone measured despite the anger building in my chest. "You told prospective students that my funding was at risk. That is not accurate, and it actively harmed my ability to recruit." He had shrugged with theatrical innocence. "I gave them my honest assessment of the funding landscape. I am not going to sugarcoat things for prospective students. They deserve to make informed decisions. Your assessment was wrong. That is your opinion, Nolan. I have been evaluating research viability for 3 decades. I think I know what a sustainable program looks like. There it was again. The dismissal wrapped in credentials. 30 years of experience deployed like a shield against any challenge, no matter how factual. I started documenting everything after that conversation. Emails, meeting notes, dates, exact quotes when I could remember them. Something in my gut told me I was going to need receipts. The isolation deepened through 2021 in ways that were hard to explain to anyone outside academia. Graham did not yell or threaten or engage in anything that would constitute obvious harassment. He was far too sophisticated for that. Instead, he practiced what I came to think of as administrative suffocation, a slow, methodical withdrawal of oxygen that left you gasping but unable to point to a single dramatic incident. He removed me from the department's external advisory board, saying he needed someone with a broader research perspective. He stopped inviting me to meetings with visiting scholars and potential collaborators, even when their work intersected directly with mine. He assigned me to teach an additional undergraduate course, increasing my teaching load from 2 to 3 courses per semester, while my structural biology colleagues taught only 1 or 2. When I raised the teaching load issue with the Associate Dean, Dr. Linda Fairbanks, she had been sympathetic, but ultimately unhelpful. I hear your concerns, Nolan, and I agree that equity in teaching assignments is important, but department heads have broad discretion in how they allocate instructional responsibilities. If you feel your research is being impacted, I would encourage you to discuss it directly with Graham. I had discussed it with Graham multiple times. Each conversation followed the same pattern. I would present a specific documented concern, and he would acknowledge it with vague pleasantries, promise to look into it, and then do nothing. Or worse, he would retaliate subtly by adding another small burden, or removing another small support. Meanwhile, my research was suffering. With fewer students, less space, and reduced internal funding, my publication rate slowed. I still managed to publish, but instead of 3 or 4 papers a year, I was producing 1 or 2. My NIH grant renewal application, which should have been straightforward given my strong preliminary data, received lukewarm reviews. One reviewer noted that my productivity appeared to be declining and questioned whether I could sustain the project. I suspected Graham had been contacted as a reference during the review process, though I could never prove it. What I could prove was that he had written a tepid letter of support for my renewal, a letter I only saw after filing a Freedom of Information Act request for my grant file. In a section where department heads typically describe the institutional support available to the researcher, Graham had written, Dr. Carrick has adequate resources to pursue his research agenda, though the department's current strategic priorities are focused on other areas of biological science. Dr. Carrick's work, while competent, represents a smaller component of our overall research portfolio. Competent, adequate, smaller component. Those words were academic poison, carefully chosen to damn with faint praise without saying anything technically untrue. My grant renewal was funded but at a reduced level, $120,000 instead of $180,000, forcing me to cut one of my remaining graduate students from the project. I sat in my office the evening I received that news, reading Graham's letter on my computer screen, and felt something I had been fighting for 2 years. Despair. Not anger, not frustration, but the hollow, heavy certainty that I was being slowly erased from my own career by a man who considered my life's work forgettable. The turning point began, as these things often do, with a phone call I almost did not answer. It was a Thursday afternoon in October 2022. I was grading undergraduate lab reports in my office, the door closed, trying to ignore the construction noise from the structural biology expansion happening 2 floors below. My phone rang with an international number I did not recognize. I normally let unknown calls go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. Dr. Carrick? This is Dr. Yuki Tanaka from the Kessler Foundation in Geneva. Do you have a few minutes to speak? Dr. Yuki Tanaka was the executive director of the Kessler Foundation for Biomedical Innovation, one of the most prestigious private research foundations in the world. The Kessler Award was their flagship grant program, funding high-risk, high-reward biomedical research that traditional agencies often considered too unconventional to support. I had applied for the Kessler Award 6 months earlier at the suggestion of a former postdoctoral advisor who knew my work intimately and believed the TCR project was exactly the kind of research the foundation was designed to support. I had submitted the application without telling anyone at Langford, partly because I did not want Graham to interfere, and partly because I considered it a long shot. The acceptance rate was around 8%. Dr. Tanaka, of course, I am available, I had managed, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. Wonderful. I am calling because our selection committee has completed its review of this year's applications, and I am pleased to inform you that your proposal on targeted chromatin remodeling for neurodegenerative disease has been selected for full funding under the Kessler International Research Award. The grant is $230,000 over 3 years, dispersed directly to you as the principal investigator with institutional overhead at 15%. Congratulations, Dr. Carrick. Your work stood out significantly among this year's applicants. I remember gripping my desk with my free hand. I remember my vision going slightly blurry. I remember Dr. Tanaka continuing to speak about logistics, official notification timelines, the public announcement scheduled for the following month, an invitation to present at the Kessler Symposium in Zurich. I said the right things, thanked her, asked appropriate questions about next steps. But inside my head, a single thought was repeating on a loop so loud it drowned out everything else. They funded me. They funded me. They actually funded me. After the call ended, I sat at my desk for 10 minutes without moving. Then I opened my personal email and found the official notification, a formal letter on Kessler Foundation letterhead with my name, the project title, the funding amount, and the signatures of 5 selection committee members. 2 of them were Nobel laureates. One was a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Another was the former director of the European Molecular Biology Laboratory. These were not mid-tier reviewers rubber-stamping applications. These were the most accomplished biomedical scientists in the world, and they had read my research proposal and judged it worthy of significant investment. I had saved the email, taken a screenshot on my phone, and then walked to the bathroom down the hall because my legs felt unsteady and I needed cold water on my face. I was standing at the sink, staring at my own reflection, when an email alert buzzed on my phone. It was from Graham's administrative assistant, Donna Whitaker. Subject: Mandatory faculty meeting, tomorrow 3 p.m., Whitfield, 612. The body of the email was brief. Professor Ashworth has called a department-wide faculty meeting to discuss research productivity and strategic planning for the upcoming academic year. Attendance is required for all full-time faculty. A faculty meeting on research productivity, called with less than 24 hours' notice. That was unusual. Graham typically scheduled these things weeks in advance with detailed agendas. Something felt wrong about the timing, though I could not have articulated exactly what. I had gone home that evening and told no one about the Kessler Award. Not my girlfriend Marin, not my graduate students, not my colleagues. Dr. Tanaka had mentioned that the formal public announcement would come from the foundation in approximately 4 weeks, and I wanted to wait for that. I also had a strategic instinct, barely formed but already hardening into a plan, that the timing of my disclosure mattered enormously. If Graham was about to do what I thought he was about to do, I wanted the Kessler Award in my back pocket like a loaded weapon. The next afternoon, I walked into Whitfield 612 at 2:58 with my phone in my jacket pocket and a calm I did not entirely feel. The conference room was full. 14 faculty members, Graham at the head of the table, his laptop open, a PowerPoint presentation projected on the screen behind him. The title slide read, Department of Biological Sciences, Research Productivity Review and Strategic Realignment. I had taken my usual seat near the middle of the table next to Dr. Kenji Okafor, a computational biologist who had been at Langford for 12 years and who had quietly become one of my few allies in the department. Kenji had glanced at me as I sat down, his expression unreadable. "You see the agenda?" he had murmured. "There is no agenda," I had murmured back. "That is the problem." Graham had started the meeting with a 15-minute overview of departmental metrics, total publications, grant dollars, citation indices, and student placement rates. The numbers were presented selectively, emphasizing areas where the department had improved, all of which happened to be in structural biology, and downplaying areas where performance had declined. Then he had moved to individual faculty assessments. He went alphabetically. Mine was third. Dr. Nolan Carrick, Graham had said, clicking to a new slide. My name was at the top, followed by a series of bullet points tracking my publications, grants, and student supervision over the past 3 years. The data was accurate but stripped of all context. It showed a declining publication rate without mentioning the lab space reduction. It showed reduced grant funding without mentioning his tepid support letter. It showed fewer graduate students without mentioning his interference in recruitment. Nolan has been with us since 2016, working primarily in epigenetic mechanisms, Graham had said, his tone clinically neutral in a way that somehow felt more hostile than open aggression. While his early work showed promise, his recent productivity has fallen below departmental benchmarks. His current external funding is at a reduced level, and his research program has not demonstrated the kind of growth we expect from faculty approaching their tenure review. My tenure review. He had said it casually, but the words landed like a grenade in the middle of the table. Several colleagues had looked at me with alarm. My tenure file was due for submission in 8 months. If Graham, as department head, submitted a negative assessment, it would be nearly impossible to overcome at the college and university levels. He was not just criticizing my work, he was signaling that he intended to torpedo my career. I had sat perfectly still, my hands flat on the table, my face carefully blank. Inside, adrenaline was flooding my system so fast I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Graham had continued, warming to his subject now that he sensed the room's discomfort. I want to be supportive, Nolan. I really do. But I have a responsibility to this department and to the university to be honest about where we stand. And let's be honest. He had paused, looking directly at me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sympathy. Your work is forgettable. No serious institution would ever fund you. If you want my advice, and I mean this constructively, you should seriously consider whether an academic research career is the right path for you. There are excellent positions in industry and science communication that might be a better fit for your skill set. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. 14 faculty members sat frozen. Some looked at their laptops. Some looked at me. Dr. Lena Vasquez, an ecologist who had been at Langford for 20 years and had never liked Graham, was staring at him with open contempt. Kenji had his hand over his mouth. I had let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds. Then I had done something that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. I smiled. Not a tight, angry smile or a sarcastic one. A genuine, relaxed smile, the kind you make when something is so absurd that the only honest response is amusement. "You are absolutely right, Graham," I had said, my voice steady. "I appreciate your candor." The relief on his face was instantaneous and nauseating. He had expected a fight, or tears, or stammering defensiveness. My calm agreement had validated him completely. "Good," he had said, visibly pleased. "I am glad you are taking this in the right spirit. We can discuss specific steps in our next one-on-one." "Actually," I had said, "I have one question before we move on. When you say no serious institution would fund my work, are you including the Kessler Foundation in that assessment?" Graham blinked. "The Kessler Foundation?" "Yes. The Kessler Foundation for Biomedical Innovation, based in Geneva. They fund approximately 40 researchers worldwide each year. Selection committee includes 2 Nobel Prize winners, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and the former director of the European Molecular Biology Laboratory." I paused, letting each credential land individually. "I ask because I received their official notification yesterday that my TCR research has been selected for full funding under the Kessler International Research Award, $230,000 over 3 years. So I am curious whether you consider them a serious institution or not." The room did not erupt. It imploded. Silently, violently, inwardly. Every head turned toward Graham. His face went through 4 distinct phases in about 6 seconds. Confusion, as if I had spoken in a foreign language. Recognition, as the name Kessler registered. Shock, as the implications hit him. And then something I had never seen on his face before. Fear. "That is, I was not informed of this," he stammered. "No," I agreed. "You were not. When did you... How?" "I applied 6 months ago. The selection process is independent, so there was no institutional notification until the award was finalized. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the executive director, called me personally yesterday afternoon to confirm. I have the official notification letter in my email if you would like to see it." I had pulled out my phone and opened the email, turning the screen toward the table. The Kessler Foundation letterhead was visible even from a distance, elegant and unmistakable. Kenji broke the silence first. "The Kessler Award," he said, his voice carrying a weight of respect that filled the room. "Nolan, that is extraordinary. Congratulations." "Dr." Vasquez followed immediately. "That is one of the most competitive grants in biomedical research. The acceptance rate is under 10%. This is a tremendous achievement for you and for this department." Other voices joined, a cascade of congratulations and genuine surprise. The mood in the room shifted so dramatically that it felt like the air pressure had changed. Faculty, who had been sitting in uncomfortable silence, were now leaning forward, asking questions about the research, the foundation, the symposium invitation. Graham stood at the front of the room, gripping the edge of the table, his PowerPoint still glowing behind him with my name and a list of deficiencies that had just been rendered absurd. He looked like a man who had pulled the pin on a grenade and watched it explode in his own hand. "Well," he managed after a long, terrible pause. That is wonderful news, Nolan. I was not aware of this development when I prepared my remarks. Obviously, this changes the context significantly." "Does it?" I asked, and my voice was quiet now, genuinely curious. "Because everything you said about my publication rate, my lab resources, my graduate student numbers, all of that is still true. Those things happened. They just did not happen, because my work is forgettable. They happened because you classified my entire field as Tier 3, took away a third of my lab space, denied my internal funding applications, steered prospective students away from my lab, and wrote a deliberately tepid letter of support for my NIH renewal. The Kessler Foundation did not have those handicaps when they evaluated my research. They just looked at the science, and they funded it." I had not raised my voice. I did not need to. Every word landed in a room so quiet I could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Graham's mouth opened, then closed. He looked around the table for support and found none. Even the structural biologists he had favored were looking at him with new eyes, the dawning realization that if he had done this to me, he could do it to anyone. "I think we should table the rest of this discussion," Graham said tightly. "We can revisit the strategic planning items at a future meeting." "Before we do," I said, "I want to state for the record, in front of the entire department, that I intend to file a formal complaint with the Dean's office regarding systematic obstruction of my research program by the department head. I have documentation going back 3 years. I stood up, gathered my things, and walked out of Whitfield 612. The formal complaint was filed the following Monday with the Office of Academic Affairs. I had spent the weekend organizing my documentation into a 62-page file with supporting exhibits. 3 years of emails, meeting notes, resource allocation records, teaching load comparisons, graduate student recruitment data, and the FOIA obtained copy of Graham's support letter for my NIH renewal. I had also contacted a faculty rights attorney named Douglas Harmon, a former professor turned lawyer who specialized in academic employment disputes. Douglas had practiced for 23 years, represented faculty at over 40 universities, and had a reputation for meticulous, relentless advocacy. When I showed him my documentation, he had been quiet for a long time, reading through the file page by page in his office downtown. Then he had looked up and said, "Dr. Carrick, this is one of the most clearly documented cases of academic retaliation and obstruction I have ever seen. The pattern is textbook: resource deprivation, workload inflation, sabotage of external funding, interference with graduate student recruitment, and culminating in a public statement designed to undermine your tenure case. If your university does not act on this, we will go to the Board of Trustees." The complaint was received by the Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs, Dr. Raymond Holt, a historian with 31 years at Langford who had overseen dozens of faculty grievance cases. He assigned an independent review panel of 3 senior faculty members from outside the biology department, a chemist named Dr. Ingrid Solvang, a mathematician named Dr. Alan Prescott, and a psychologist named Dr. Mona Abbasi. The panel had access to all my documentation plus full authority to request additional records from the department. The investigation took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, 3 things happened that accelerated Graham's downfall faster than even I had anticipated. First, 2 other faculty members in the biology department filed their own complaints. Dr. Kenji Okafor, who had been silently enduring similar resource deprivation for 2 years, submitted a 38-page grievance detailing how Graham had systematically redirected computational biology resources to structural biology projects. And Dr. Amara Osei, a junior faculty member in microbiology who had joined Langford a year after me, filed a complaint alleging that Graham had blocked her from submitting a collaborative grant application because, as he had told her in a private meeting, the department cannot support unfocused research agendas that dilute our core mission. Amara had recorded that meeting on her phone. The audio was submitted as evidence. Second, someone, and I never found out who, contacted Graham's former institution on the East Coast. What they discovered was that Graham had left not for new leadership challenges, as he had claimed, but because the university's ombudsman office had substantiated complaints from 3 faculty members alleging that he had systematically undermined their research programs to consolidate resources around his own projects. The investigation had concluded that while Graham's actions did not constitute formal misconduct, they represented a pattern of management behavior that was detrimental to the academic mission. He had been given the option to resign quietly or face a formal review by the faculty senate. He resigned and came to Langford, where no one knew about his history because universities, like all institutions, are terrible at sharing information about problem employees. Third, the Kessler Foundation published their annual award announcement. My name appeared on a list of 38 researchers worldwide who had been selected for funding, accompanied by a brief description of the TCR project and a quote from the selection committee chair, Professor Hans Werner Richter, calling my work a paradigm-shifting approach to neurodegenerative disease that represents the cutting edge of epigenetic therapeutics. The announcement was picked up by several science news outlets, including Nature News and Science Magazine's online section. My university's communications office, which had barely acknowledged my existence for 3 years, suddenly wanted to write a feature article. They called me on a Wednesday morning, breathless with enthusiasm. "Dr. Carrick, congratulations on the Kessler Award. We would love to profile you and your research for the university homepage. This is exactly the kind of achievement that raises our institutional profile." I had agreed to the profile, not because I needed the publicity, but because I wanted the documentation. Every article, every mention, every external validation was another brick in the wall I was building. The review panel completed its investigation in early December 2022. I was called to a meeting in the provost's office, a room I had never been in before, on the 8th floor of the administration building with large windows overlooking the campus quad. Present were Associate Provost Raymond Holt, the 3 panel members, the Dean of the College of Sciences, Dr. Warren Pritchard, who had originally appointed Graham, my attorney Douglas Harmon, and me. The panel's findings were presented by Dr. Ingrid Solvang, who read from a 30-page report with the dispassionate precision of a scientist presenting experimental results. The panel found that Graham Ashworth had engaged in a sustained pattern of discriminatory resource allocation that disproportionately disadvantaged researchers outside his personal area of expertise. The panel found that his intervention in graduate student recruitment constituted inappropriate interference with faculty research autonomy. The panel found that his letter of support for my NIH renewal contained language that was deliberately designed to undermine confidence in my research program. The panel found that his public statements at the October faculty meeting, including characterizing my work as forgettable and claiming that no serious institution would fund it, constituted a violation of the university's policy on professional conduct and created a hostile work environment. And the panel found that this pattern was consistent with substantiated findings from his previous institution, which Langford's administration had failed to discover during the hiring process due to inadequate reference checking. The report recommended that Graham Ashworth be removed as department head immediately, that his conduct be referred to the faculty senate for further review, and that the university take steps to restore the resources that had been diverted from affected faculty members. Dr. Pritchard, the dean who had hired Graham, looked like he was attending his own funeral. He had championed Graham's appointment, overridden the search committee's concerns about the abbreviated process, and essentially installed him as department head based on reputation and personal connection. The panel's finding that the hiring process had been inadequate was an implicit indictment of Pritchard's judgment. The university moved faster than I expected, which told me they were terrified of legal exposure. Graham Ashworth was removed as department head within a week of the report's release. He was not fired from the university because tenured faculty are nearly impossible to terminate, but he was stripped of all administrative authority. His research budget was frozen pending a full audit, and he was reassigned to a standard teaching position with no supervisory responsibilities. The announcement was made via a terse email from the provost's office that cited administrative restructuring without mentioning the investigation or its findings. The real consequences, the ones that mattered to me, came in the weeks that followed. The department's research tier system was dissolved. Lab space was redistributed equitably. Internal funding allocations were placed under a new review process with rotating committee membership and conflict of interest protections. 3 new graduate students were recruited for the following fall, 2 of whom specifically requested to work in my lab after reading about the Kessler Award. And my tenure review, which Graham had been preparing to sabotage, was overseen by an interim department head, Dr. Vasquez, who had volunteered for the role with the explicit statement that she wanted to ensure the process was fair and based on actual merit. My tenure file went forward in the spring of 2023 with the Kessler Award, my full publication record, letters from external reviewers who called my work groundbreaking, and a departmental assessment written by someone who actually understood what good science looked like. It was approved unanimously at every level. Graham Ashworth remained at Langford for another semester, but his presence was ghostly. He taught his courses, attended no faculty meetings, and kept his office door closed. The Faculty Senate review resulted in a formal censure, a rare action that was noted in his permanent file and effectively ended any possibility of him holding an administrative position at any university again. His structural biology colleagues, the ones he had favored with resources and protection, distanced themselves from him so quickly it was almost comical. One of them, a professor named Dr. Neil Sutton, who had received the largest share of redirected funding, actually came to my office to apologize. "Nolan, I want you to know that I did not realize the extent of what Graham was doing. I benefited from his system, and I should have asked more questions about where the resources were coming from. I am sorry." I had accepted his apology because it seemed sincere and because holding grudges is exhausting. I was too busy rebuilding my lab to waste energy on resentment. Graham left Langford at the end of the academic year. I heard through the academic grapevine that he took a position at a small teaching college in the Midwest, a significant step down from a research university. He would have no graduate students, no major grants, no department to control. Whether he learned anything from the experience, I honestly do not know and have stopped caring. Some people change when they face consequences. Others just find smaller stages to perform on. In April 2023, I flew to Zurich for the Kessler Symposium. I presented the TCR research to an audience of 200 scientists, including several whose papers I had read as a graduate student. The presentation went well. People asked sharp questions, challenged my methodology, suggested improvements, and treated my work with the kind of rigorous respect that is the highest compliment in science. After the talk, Dr. Tanaka had found me at the reception. "Dr. Carrick, your presentation was excellent. I want you to know that when your application came in, our committee was immediately struck by the elegance of the TCR approach. One of our reviewers said it was the most creative epigenetic strategy she had seen in 20 years. That means more than you know," I had said, and my voice cracked slightly on the last word, which embarrassed me. "Can I ask you something honestly? When you called me in October, I was sitting in my office grading lab reports, convinced that my career was essentially over. That phone call changed everything." Dr. Tanaka had smiled. "Your career was never over, Dr. Carrick. It was being obstructed. Those are very different things. The quality of your science was always there. Sometimes it just takes one door opening for the world to see what was always true." 1 year after that conversation, my lab had grown to 8 graduate students and 2 postdoctoral researchers. The TCR project had produced preliminary results showing a 63% reduction in neurodegeneration markers in mouse models, results that had been published in a top-tier journal and covered by several major science outlets. 3 pharmaceutical companies had contacted me about licensing discussions. I was invited to join the editorial board of a leading epigenetics journal, and I had been approached by 2 universities about senior faculty positions, one of which came with an endowed chair. I turned both down. I was staying at Langford because the department, freed from Graham's stranglehold, had become the collaborative environment Constance had originally envisioned. Marin and I had gotten engaged in September. She had proposed to me, actually, on a hike in the mountains outside Zurich, where we had traveled for a follow-up meeting with the Kessler Foundation. She pulled a ring out of her jacket pocket at the summit, where the clouds were below us and the air was thin and cold, and she said, "I watched you almost give up on yourself. I am not going to let you give up on us either." I said yes before she finished the sentence. Last month, I received an email from Priya Anand, the graduate student Graham had steered away from my lab 3 years earlier. She had completed her PhD at another university, working in structural biology, as Graham had recommended. But she had followed my research from afar, read my Kessler-funded papers, and watched the TCR results with growing excitement. Dr. Carrick, she wrote, I made the wrong choice in 2020, and I have regretted it ever since. I chose a research direction based on someone else's fear, not on my own passion. I am writing to ask whether you have any postdoctoral positions available. I want to work on TCR. I want to work with you. I want to do the science I should have been doing all along. I wrote back immediately. I told her that she had not made the wrong choice. She had made the choice that was available to her at the time, with the information she had. I told her that she was welcome in my lab any time. And I told her something I wished someone had told me during those dark years when Graham was slowly convincing me that my work did not matter. The quality of your science is not determined by the people who try to diminish it. It is determined by the truth of what you discover. No one can take that from you. I think about Graham's words sometimes, not with anger, but with a kind of bewildered gratitude. He told me my work was forgettable. The Kessler Foundation called it paradigm shifting. He told me no serious institution would fund me. I am now funded by 3 of the most serious institutions in biomedical research. He told me I should consider leaving academia. I just received tenure at the university where he could not survive. He was wrong about everything, and the world knows it now. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.